Start over the break. I'm going to bring it up right here so I can make sure. Yeah. Okay. I want to give it a second. Okay. So we're live. Yeah. All right. So I think we have it. So I'm Pearson Crosby. Today's virtual village education slot is the United States of Cognitive Sorry, excuse me. But I have Professor Joe Vitriol with me. He is a political social psychologist with Harvard University. He has undergraduate in forensic psychology and is a professor at Harvard. I personally know Joe from growing up. We're good friends, and I'm happy to have him here. With today's unrest and everything that's going on, and personally, I guess it's kind of confusing for me. I want to say confusing, but I feel like I'm out of the loop with Alaska. In Alaska, we don't have much the population that the rest of the lower 48 has, and I've been wanting to have this conversation with him, and I'm glad that we're able to do it and share the conversation. Joe, would you like to say hello?
Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm very happy to be able to speak with you and have this conversation with Pearson. And like Pearson says, he and I go way back and have had many conversations like this before. And so I'm happy to be able to participate in this town hall and speak to the MassCann community about topics that I'm sure many of you are thinking a lot about. And I'm very much looking forward to having this conversation.
Cool. So right now we have this COVID-19, which, like I said, it affected Alaska. It's still affecting Alaska, but I don't think it's affecting us nearly to the point of what some of the bigger cities have throughout the United States. And you have all these theories, and I don't know, some people believe that it's being that it's just as bad as everybody says it is, and the other side says it's just a conspiracy or something that's made up to deflect us or keep us otherwise entertained. What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts are that it's very real. It's very consequential. We are living with the consequences of it on a daily basis. There are a wide range of conspiratorial explanations for the origins of the virus, its severity, its magnitude, whether government institutions have acted appropriately in the United States and elsewhere to educate and inform the public and manage the consequences of infectious disease like COVID spreading throughout the population. And so I would say that there should be some consensus within the scientific community, and public health experts view this as a very serious and very real threat. There is some uncertainty and there are some unknowns, and it's a fast changing information environment. So it can be difficult and challenging to really understand what's going on. And there's a lot of uncertainty and the stakes are very high. And so the tendency to adopt psychologically meaningful, but perhaps practically unrealistic beliefs is very high. So Pearson, I thought maybe it would be a good idea for me to just talk a little bit about my background and how I as a scientist approach some of these questions. So go a little bit more about, so that I'm not just bullshitting, though I am bullshitting.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
All right. So like Pearson said, my background is as a social and political psychologist. I'm trained as a scientist to study why and how people think and act and arrive at their opinions and their beliefs, with particular attention to the political and the legal domain. So I do a lot of work in forensic psychology looking at eyewitness memory and eyewitness lineup procedures, jury decision-making, jury selection, police interrogations, and bias in policing, which I think we're going to be talking about a little bit more later on, because I have experience training law enforcement as well as intelligence officers on the science of the human mind in ways designed to improve objectivity and accuracy in their decision making, to be able to avoid some of the issues that have led to protests this past few months, but also the past 5 or 10 years, and even further back than that. And I also wear, as a second hat, I moonlight as a political psychologist, and I study things like how people form their ideologies and their political identities, how political information affects the things that they think, the information that they seek out, the decisions that they make, whether and why they adopt views that are consistent with scientific evidence and the recommendations from professional experts, say, for example, members of the public health community, and what impact false information or fake news may have on people's perceptions of social and political reality, and the broader implications of all of these dynamics for the functioning of our institutions, the effectiveness of our public policies, and the skill with which our leaders are able to govern in an evidence-based way, which, because of the pandemic, has never been more important. So I'd be happy to share a little bit about the methods that scientists like me adopt to be able to study some of these phenomena. But I suspect that probably we want to talk more about what we know and how it might inform our discussion about some of the things that Pearson, you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, no, Joe, why don't you continue on, because I think it's important for people to realize or to hear what the professionals, the experts have to go through in order to come to these conclusions, or what the scientific method of so please continue.
Sure. So, of course, we adopt the scientific method, which is as simple as a process by which we establish standards of evidence and means of systematically observing phenomenon in our natural world. And from a scientific perspective, what we seek to do is make observations and quantify our observations in a systematic and a consistent way that allow us to test our hypotheses about what it is that's going on in the real world. And what makes it a scientific approach is that those hypotheses are subject to rigorous attempts at falsification. My job is to prove myself wrong. I try to set up experiments or set up studies where I am trying to prove my hypothesis incorrect. And that hypothesis comes from scientific theories that organize other observations from the scientific method. And I seek to try to prove myself wrong. I set up difficult tests under which it would be unlikely to have observed evidence consistent with the hypothesis through chance alone. And I try to prove myself wrong. And my failure to prove myself wrong is taken as evidence consistent with the hypothesis. Now, this is a really important distinction for scientific ways of thinking versus non-scientific ways of thinking. Non-scientific ways of thinking are non-falsifiable. Now, non-scientific ways of thinking are appropriate ways of understanding the world, of deriving meaning about the world. And I don't mean to suggest that science is the only way that we can make claims about the nature of things. But I'm, as a scientist, one who values empiricism and evidence-based analysis. And so from my perspective, I have confidence in claims that have been subject to rigorous attempts at falsification and have survived. And it survives by having produced evidence consistent with my hypothesis that would be unlikely to have occurred through chance alone. And we use tools like experiments and surveys and psychological instruments and naturalistic observation to measure people's thoughts and beliefs and attitudes and psychological traits and characteristics. We often do this just by asking them what they think and what they believe and what they perceive in themselves and what they perceive in others. Other times, we establish experiments where we manipulate conditions under which we would expect to observe certain behavior or ways of thinking that would be evidence that's consistent with the hypothesis. So if you think about drug testing, or what will happen if we get a vaccine, how scientific bodies will investigate whether or not these vaccines are in fact appropriate and healthy and effective. What they do is that they randomly assign people to one of two different conditions. And by random assignment, I don't mean haphazard or callous. I mean that people have an equal chance of being placed in one of two different conditions. Those conditions, if it's a scientific study, should be identical. And the only thing that should differ between those two conditions is the thing that we're trying to manipulate. So if my hypothesis is that this vaccine will provide immunity to COVID-19, I take a group of people, I randomly assign them to receive a vaccine that's expected or hypothesized to be effective, and I compare that against people who take a placebo. Sometimes it's a sugar pill, sometimes it's a different type of a placebo. And the idea here is that because there's no difference between our two groups, our control group and our experimental group, other than the variable that we're manipulating, any difference that we observe between those two groups can be attributed to the causal effect of that variable that we're manipulating. So this is how psychologists study things like how memory can be flawed or lead to error in judgment, and why sometimes people might identify an erroneous suspect. It can be used to understand the kind of evidence that jurors might rely upon when they reach a guilty verdict. It can inform our understanding of why or how or if police treat some individuals differently when we hold constant features of the crime, backgrounds of the defendant or the suspect or whatever. And we can do this in the political space too. We can measure people's opinions and beliefs, and we can do this using surveys that are commonly used in pretty much every other major industry. So surveys and polls are used in politics and marketing and advertisement and TV, in all scientific communities. And we can measure what people think and what they believe. And we can use that to predict change in their attitudes over time, to predict their behavior, like who they show up to vote for, whether they are seeking out credible information or instead turn to partisan information sources or seek out fake news or whatever it might be. And this gives us a good scientific lens for generating what we refer to as an empirical or evidence-based understanding of how people are thinking or acting, that allow us to isolate causal factors, that allow us to understand characteristics of individuals that predict behaviors that we may care about.
Yeah, I mean, so the scientific method's pretty proven. It's a pretty proven way about going about things. Is do you consider psychology as soft science?
You know, soft science is often used as a pejorative. It's a young science. It's different than physics or chemistry or biology, in that we are operating in an open system and we measure our constructs and our variables with a high level of error. It's very difficult to measure depression. It doesn't exist. It's not a construct that exists in physical reality.
Yes.
We infer its existence because of the effects that it has on observable phenomena, but it's an indirect measure. So in that sense, it has a lot more error, and it's an open system where we don't know all that we could possibly know about the phenomena that we're studying to really better understand external validity, generalizability of the observations that we're making. It's a young science in that it's relatively new. It's only been around for about 40 or 50 years. It originally developed in philosophy, as all sciences did, but it, as a quantitative or empirical discipline that adopts the kind of methods or perspectives that I described earlier, it's a relatively young science. And that gives us some limitations in terms of the kind of claims that we can make. There's a lot we don't know. And one of the big limitations is that a lot of what I'll be talking about concerns general phenomena, on average, how people act under certain circumstances or as a function of specific characteristics or traits. But we can't make claims about specific behavior. We can't say that because on average, people who have this trait act this way, we can't then say, well, this person acted this way, that means they have this trait. So there are some limitations, and it's a really good question as to whether or not we have the empirical basis to make the kind of causal claims that we see more commonly in more developed and matured sciences. So I'm going to do my very best to speak with humility. That's not a strength of mine. But you should certainly always challenge me on the basis of the evidence and whether or not the observations that we make under certain conditions replicate to other kind of conditions. Yeah,
it's I'm a big I love it. Most of the books I read, anything that it's about human behavior, and especially it helps me when I train the police departments and in crisis intervention.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something that you just, at least for me, I'll be reading or listening to a book on audio, and I'll hear something that just, you know, makes sense. Like I'm not going to bring up an example right now, but well, I guess I will. So I mentioned I was going to talk about this experiment, but the people's behavior with authority. I think that's a big topic right now. Our willingness or unwillingness to follow authority. I from what I understand is that people would there's some studies that show like people would rather die or so go to extremes rather than disobey authority. I think that was one of the craziest experiments, or the craziest things I heard about were the experiments where people were brought in. Was it the Milgram experiments? Yeah. So
Stanley Milgram.
So where they had volunteers on either side. One was there to be electrocuted. The other one was there to dole out the levels of electrocution. And I think all but like 2 people went all the way through with it, even after people were begging for them to stop after like 100 volts, I believe it was. You care to explain that a little bit better than I can?
It's a very famous experiment, Pearson, and one that really attracted the attention of the general public, but also the scientific and scholarly community generally when it happened. And even now, 60 years later, it's something that I still teach, even though I would suggest that it's not a true experiment. Explain what I mean by that. But what it's properly understood as is a demonstration of how, under the correct conditions, people might be willing to suspend their moral and ethical judgment to follow the dictates of an authority figure. So Stanley Milgram devised a series of studies to evaluate this exact question. And the question that he was interested in is, why do people obey authority? And would they be willing to obey authority even after they've observed the harm that their actions cause? And Stanley Milgram was part of a series of psychologists that really emerged after World War II, who were very much interested in understanding what happened in Europe. How is it that Nazism rose? How is it that democracy fell? How is it that otherwise good and decent people became complicit, silent, and willing to conform to a totalitarian form of fascist government? And Stanley Milgram was convinced that Americans were different, that we were individualistic and we were skeptical of authority, and that we would, because of our culture, be particularly able to resist following a authority figure's dictates that violated our conscience. And he was wrong. And what he did was that he brought people into the lab at I think he would have been at Yale. He brought people into the lab. He approached them wearing a long white lab coat. So he's a tall, kind of good-looking guy. So he's got an authoritative presence. And he brought them into the lab and he put them in front of a chair. And he also put them in a waiting room with somebody that was called a teacher. A learner. The way the study is set up is that the community members are teachers, and the learner is what we refer to as a confederate. That is somebody who is in on the experiment and is essentially faking things in order to maintain deception so that the actual participants don't know what's going on in the context that they're being observed. So they bring people into the lab. They tell them that it's their job to educate this learner. The learner, again, is a member of the research team. And that they're going to go through a series of a memory test where it's the job of the learner to remember a list of words. And every error that the learner made was subject to a shock, an electrical shock, by the teacher. So this is the way the paradigm works. People come into the lab, and it's their job to punish someone they just met for making a mistaken error. And every time they punish that person, they have to go back and restate the list. and the severity and the harshness of the shock increases. And they're brought into the lab and they see this electric shock machine, which was designed to be this really intimidating apparatus. And it looks like Dexter's Laboratory, okay? And so they totally believe that this is real. They even, in some versions of the study, might have even been given light doses of the shock so that they could confirm that it was actually a real thing. And the way the study proceeds is that the learner, his behavior is scripted. And they're always making errors, and they're always crying out in pain upon receiving the shock in the same way across participants. And the key question that Milgram and his team wanted to know is how far will participants go delivering this shock that was very painful, that involved the learner crying out in pain and even saying that he was having a heart attack and needed medical care. And the question was, would people keep delivering this shock? Would they keep causing harm to this person? And the answer to that is yes. As you said, most people go very far in delivering really painful shock to the level in which they believe that they were actually delivering fatal levels of shock and are hearing the Confederate call out in pain and discomfort. And what Stanley Milgram demonstrates is that a lot of people sitting in that chair, being the one that did that punishment, were willing to do so when they were reassured by the experimenter that it was their job and their responsibility to do it. People expressed doubt, they expressed hesitancy, they expressed concern about the well-being of the person that they were shocking over really simple errors in memorizing a word list. And people kept causing pain. When they would hesitate, Milgram would say, it's your job to deliver the shock, the responsibility is mine. And what he found was that simple reassurance that it was his responsibility and it was their job to do what was asked of them made people willing to essentially kill another person in the room next to them. Now, the study was done on many occasions. It involved many different participants under different conditions. So to Stanley Milgram's great shock, the same basic dynamic was observed among working class professionals, teachers, educators, police officers, doctors, nurses, social workers, priests, everybody. Nobody was immune from the basic influence that authority has on the willingness to act even against one's own consciousness. What they found to be the one thing that mitigated the willingness to deliver shock was when people were in the same room as the person that was suffering. When they experienced the pain with that person, when they sat there and saw the discomfort, the willingness to follow authority went down. So it's a demonstration of the power of authority. It's a demonstration of how people can ignore their own private beliefs and act unethically. It's also, however, a demonstration of how being connected to other human beings can increase empathy that could undermine one's willingness to act harmfully against them, even when an authority figure tells them to do so. And also, what's really important, and back, Pearson, to what you decided to name this discussion as, is cognitive dissonance. Yep. People that were in that study experienced crippling cognitive dissonance. I encourage everybody to Google this at home. Stanley Milgram shock experiment. Much of it is recorded. You can see in live time how people were struggling with their knowledge that they were causing somebody harm and the pressures of the situation to continue doing what the authority figure asked them. That tension, that cognitive dissonance between what one was doing and what one knows they should have been doing, created an incredible anxiety in many of the participants. You will see people at various points in time fidgeting, sweating, sitting uncomfortably, and even laughing maniacally in fits of discomfort and anxiety over what was happening. So again, it's a very human phenomenon. We're influenced by our social context. We follow people we trust. We follow people that we place confidence in. And we might even be willing to suspend our own ethics and values to do so when we don't necessarily see any way out of that situation.
Yeah, I think it just what that tells me, I guess it's people will never understand what it's like to be in that position unless they're in that position. I mean, they do it every day. They follow the guidelines of what we perceive as authority, where we stay in the lines because we might get in trouble or something like that. Or it's just this obedience to what we think is morally correct, I guess. And if you can pawn the blame off, but somebody else is taking responsibility, it gives people more willingness to do something like that.
That's right. And whether that's an authority figure that you're pawning responsibility off, or whether that's scapegoating others that are perhaps not valued within a particular social context, people are very skilled at protecting themselves from realizing the consequences of their action and being held morally and ethically responsible for it.
Yeah. And that's always something that it's always got to me. Like, it's like, why try to pawn it off on somebody else? I mean, I guess I'm guilty of it. I'm sure
we're all guilty of it. Everything I have to say today and ever, it's not just about other people. It's about me too. It's about you. It's about normal, average people. It's the way the human mind operates in a social context.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I know. It's just it's crazy to, like, while you're saying this, like, I'm trying to put myself in those people's positions, and would I do that or wouldn't I? I mean, I like to hope that I wouldn't. I know, like, the two people, from what I heard, two of the people were, like, really hardcore, like, libertarian beliefs, and those were, like, two of the few people that stopped, which is not bringing harm to others is one of their.
It's important to say that there are people who do stop. You're right. There are people that say, "Whoa, this is fucked up." Excuse my language. I can't do
that. You're
good. Sorry, MassCan's.
You're cool, man.
Fucked up, and I can't believe this is happening. I want nothing to do with this. So I don't mean to paint a picture of human nature as inevitably following the lead or dictates of authority. I think, though, we have a tendency to believe that we're all individual and able to stand up against what's wrong. And I just want to remind folks that our perception of what's wrong and our perception of our responsibility to correct what's wrong is often shaped by the actions of others. And it's easy to imagine ourselves doing what's righteous, but unfortunately, because we're human beings, sometimes we don't always see the need to act ethically. Sometimes we're not willing to do so, and sometimes we don't regard the conduct or behavior to be unethical or problematic in the first place. But people do stand up. And when one person stands up to dissent from others becomes more common. Yep. So there's other really great experiments that capture a similar kind of dynamic. What Stanley Milgram was interested in is what is called obedience. Obedience is deference to an authority figure. It's a kind of social influence. But there's other kinds of social influence that don't necessarily involve a high status or authority figure telling other people what to do. We also are influenced by our friends, our family, our peers, our equals to think and act in ways that we may not be aware. So another really famous series of studies in this tradition of trying to understand what happened in Europe in World War II is some studies by a researcher named Solomon Asch. And what Asch wanted to understand is whether or not conformity through social norms among equals could lead people to perceive or report perceiving reality incorrectly. So really clever studies. What they did was that they brought people into the lab. And again, we have it set up where we have a group of people. One person is the participant. That's who we're observing. And the other people are part of the experiment. The study itself was a study of measuring the lengths of a line. And what Asch did was he presented participants an image. And on the image were three lines. One that was long, say 3 inches long, one that was smaller, noticeably smaller, and one that's very, very small. And then he said to his participants, of these 3 lines, which one matches this one over here? Very clear, very obvious answer. When people were asked by themselves which line matches the diagram, they were accurate at a very high level, 90, 95%. The error, the mistakes were mostly just error, not anything meaningful, right? So privately, people got this correct. When they didn't have to express their viewpoints publicly, they got this correct. So they knew what the answer was. Very, very easy answer. But you put them in a group setting where everybody in that group is saying the wrong answer. Now the question is, will people stick to what they know to be true, or will they conform to what everybody else is saying is wrong? And what would your guess be, Pearson?
Oh, yeah, they definitely conform.
They conform. They conform the size of a fucking line, man. And it's not like if you saw the image, if you saw the stimuli they used, there would be no doubt in your head. So that's important. People had private knowledge, but they were unwilling to express that view in the company of others that held a different perspective. So they were lying about what was obviously true in order to fit with the group. Now, that conformity goes down when there's another dissenter in that group. If another person says, "You idiots, the answer is obvious and you're wrong," all of a sudden, the willingness to stand up against conformity goes up. Dissent matters. Principles matter. And it encourages others to act in good faith and act more responsibly. One more example, because I know this is a good.
Oh yeah, no, please keep going, man. I'm loving this.
One more example where instead of the stimuli being obvious and clear and not ambiguous, that is, everybody knows the size of the line and which is correct, and nobody, like your maybe Odin couldn't get it, but a 3-year-old can answer right? There's no ambiguity. People conform publicly but not privately in the ASH studies. What happens when the stimuli or people's perceptions of reality is ambiguous or uncertain? So another line of studies by a psychologist named Sharif looked at how people made estimates of a light that was projected onto a wall. This is what is called the autokinetic illusion. Folks back home can look this up. But essentially what happens when a light is projected on a wall, people perceive it as moving. They perceive it as shaking. They don't see it as static or stable. And so this is an ambiguous stimuli. And what Sharif wanted to understand is how the presence of others shape people's perception and description of that illusion. When people were asked by themselves, the range of estimates of how much that light on the wall is moving were similar. Not too precise, but within a reasonable range. People were reporting accurately what they were seeing, even though it varied across individuals. However, you put them in a setting with others, and all of a sudden, everybody has the same opinion. Meaning, people were listening to everybody else and became confident in their judgment based on what others were reporting to see in ambiguous situations. So under ambiguity, when we don't know, when we don't have confidence in our own judgment, we rely upon what other people say and what other people believe. But also, when we have confidence in our own beliefs, sometimes we still defer to what others want in order to avoid dissent and avoid ostracization and rejection by the group. These are really basic principles, but are really profound in helping to explain why many of us, including myself, adopt the beliefs that we hold, don't always act publicly or privately in ways that align, and sometimes we end up acting in ways that are in conflict with our values and our ethics.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like the slow clap thing. Where
oh, that's a great example of that. Yeah. Or like, there's another great demonstration of how, like, in like a concert setting, the time between nobody dancing and one person dancing is like much larger than the time between one person dancing and two people dancing. We take our cues for how to think and how to act by the people in our environment. It's very normal. It's very human, but it sometimes can lead us astray.
Yeah, and that's just it. It can be we take our beliefs, or we learn from all of our from our experiences, and nobody wants to be the first. So.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard to be the first. It's risky. It goes against the group. It risks social status and social standing. It requires courage and integrity. And it becomes easier, however, when there's at least one person willing to stand up and say, you know what, this isn't okay.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I found, I mean, I've done a couple things that I can definitely say have been, yeah, I was the first one to do this. And I mean, I was still like, when I got the pictures taken for High Times magazine.
I love that photo. That's a great picture.
I'm in my camis. Like, first off, camouflage in the Marine Corps, you're not supposed to have out. You're not allowed to wear in public. I don't know if that's still the case now, but that's our work uniform. We work for the people, for the citizens of the United States. We don't want to present ourselves in our dirty work clothes.
Sure.
So like, if you're in uniform in the Marine Corps uniform, it's usually a dress uniform. But yeah, to be sitting there with a joint in my mouth, my name, my rank, I was like, oh man, I'm gonna get my skin peeled off by somebody, you know. And
that was a revolutionary act, Pearson.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, no, and nobody said anything negative to me about it. I mean, maybe one or two, but nobody official, you know. And I was really expecting it, but I don't know. I think it was a just cause, and I think people really need to realize that cannabis is something that helps a lot of people, and definitely helped me as a get off the drugs that the VA were forcing down my throat. So I thought it was a noble cause. I still think so. So that's my me stepping outside of the line to do something that's not many other people would, I guess.
Well, I think that you probably have done that far more than you realize. All of us have. We all have our own sort of private revolutions in our own ways in our, daily lives, whether it's small or big. So, again, I don't want to paint this picture that everybody is sort of blind sheep following, what powerful and influential people say. But just to kind of encourage a more critical lens as to how the actions of a single person can really change norms. And Pearson, you appearing on, that magazine as a veteran smoking weed, yes, it might have upset some rank and file, perhaps military leaders, but it also created the space for people like you to be able to speak on these topics and these issues. You challenged the norms in such a way that you created a new way of thinking, encouraged others to sort of follow suit. That's what leadership is.
Yeah, I'm way too lazy to be doing this, do labor jobs. That's why I always try to get up to leadership positions.
You and I both, man.
Yeah. So, what else? So I'm stuck on this respect for authority thing and compliance, because I just got a hold of this incredibly. I don't know if you ever heard of this book before. It's called The Most Dangerous Superstition.
No, I don't have it, but somebody else, maybe you recommended it to me before.
I probably did.
It sounds familiar. What's it called?
It's The Most Dangerous Superstition. It's by Kirby.
Rose, right?
Was that?
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, Kirby Rose. Yeah, and it's about everything. I mean, it's about the myth of authority, or how authority is only something. It's nothing tangible. It's something that's somehow given or like
constructed, right, through our social interactions and our norms.
Yes. Like it's one thing if the gang member comes up to you to extort your money once a week from your convenience store, and that's found as immoral, whereas the government has one of their paid lackeys to come and take your money, which is moral, and it's even perceived as justified. Like it's like you're a piece of shit if you don't get extorted if you don't let these people extort you, or So I've been diving deep into this sociology.
So are you familiar with Max Weber's, a very famous sociologist and philosopher, once quipped that what makes a state is the legitimate use of authority and violence. That the distinction between the gang on the street corner, strong arming convenience shop owners to pay a penance, and the government taking tax money is that the latter has a legitimate claim to exercise control and authority. And the question, where does that legitimacy come from? In the case of a small gang, their authority comes through the threat of violence. Now, that has practical consequences for our lived experience, but it doesn't have the kind of legitimacy that's going to increase compliance and conformity with the public, right? So where do states also, when they act with violence and the threat of violence and the means of control, can force compliance? But one thing that's different from a state that acts that way, and one that ostensibly we live in, is democracy. Democracy gives legitimacy to the use of authority. But when people lose confidence in those democratic institutions, when they come to perceive them as illegitimate, when they perceive them as gangs strong-arming them into paying a penance, they may, for example, take to the streets and protest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's it. I think that was the gist of it, was the overwhelming masses, overall the citizens or the people that populate that area hold that group legitimate, or have okayed their sense or their rule. And they and I mean it's incredible how but at the same time it's like they're like the government is something that is allowed to do stuff that the regular civilian cannot do.
Right.
I mean, it's just, I don't know. I'm a big fan of smaller government. The better the experience. But
I don't disagree. I think I prefer good, responsible, effective government more than small versus big.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. That's a good way to put it.
I want a small government in some domains, but I want a big government in other domains. I want a big government right now in the middle of a pandemic. I want national testing. I want national tracing. I want a federal program that integrates data so that we know holistically what's going on. But I want small government when it comes to other things, right? So, these are things that are negotiated and debated in democratic contexts, and that's what gives authority legitimacy. However, there's often disagreement and debate over the legitimacy of existing authority. And that's the domain of politics. Who deserves the lead, right? Who deserves the lead? That question is a question of legitimacy. Who deserves the confidence of the people? And that can change from time to time. And that's sort of what many people are arguing and debating about. And I would say that America now, more than in the past, has a crisis of legitimacy. We see that in the loss of confidence and trust among many communities towards police. That's where we're seeing these protests. But we also see intense polarization and political conflict between the two major parties and the coalitions that they represent. And those are deep questions about who's legitimate, whose country does this belong to? And I hate that that's the way the question is being cast, because the question, it doesn't belong to anyone, it belongs to all of us. But I do think that there's a disagreement now as to whether or not some leaders serve the interests of others the way that they should. And so authoritarianism is a way of thinking about the social conformity dynamics that we were just describing in the political domain. So authoritarianism, many people, when they hear that word, what they're thinking of is totalitarian governments or dictators, right? An authoritarian. And that's partially true. The term itself comes from psychologists that were trying to understand the kind of person that aligned themselves with fascist ideologies in Europe. And what they found was that there's a personality type. It exists among liberals, it exists among conservatives, it exists among all of us that orients itself towards strict adherence to social norms and deference to authority figures. However, people, depending on their ideology, disagree as to who the authority is. And so one thing that political scientists are studying is that there's been a rise of authoritarian orientations in our political domain. We see it on the left, we see it on the right, right now, in this particular moment, we see it more commonly on the right wing. And I would suggest that that is because of the leadership style of Donald Trump, someone who has drawn very strict boundaries around who is an American, someone who has advanced and defended sort of a past conception of America that really excluded a lot of people that weren't of a certain race or ethnicity, and a man that has sought to raise the specter of and fear and anxiety of many members of the public in order to scapegoat and marginalize disadvantaged people and to advance a political agenda that prioritizes the interests of his base. It's authoritarian in that it's rigid, it's dogmatic, it's dismissive, and it's punitive towards those that deviate from the particular identity defined by that political group. Now, we see authoritarianism on the left. We saw some of it with Bernie. We see it sometimes in the cesspool that is Twitter. But and you all know exactly what I'm talking about, right? And cancel culture would be an example of that. But one thing that's really different about our current political moment, authoritarianism exists on the left and the right. But what matters right now is the top-down leadership dynamics, where right-wing authoritarianism is now mainstream Republican belief. Left-wing authoritarianism has no home. Bernie Sanders didn't win. But even further to the left of Bernie, left-wing authoritarians don't participate in politics. They're on the streets engaged in protest and violence to some extent, but they are not the mainstream party. And this is an important reminder that people's political beliefs and political identities not only come from their own psychology, but by the influence that leadership has on what they think and what they believe. Just like in the Milgram studies, people were taking their cues as to how they should act, depending on the influence of that leader. The same thing happens in politics. People's beliefs about politics are shaped by bottom-up processes. That's their lived experience, that's their personality traits, that's their values, that's their worldview, but also top-down processes where political leaders, political elites, information is bundled by media outlets and shape what people think and what they believe. And when leaders in one political group more than another is espousing conspiracy theories, is attacking institutions of democracy, is challenging the independence of information from a free press, is devaluing and censoring scientists, is lying regularly and constantly in a verifiable way, that's a leader that is bringing his people into a way of thinking that is in conflict with observed reality. And I think that's part of what we're seeing now in this pandemic. It's not random who is tending to believe that the pandemic isn't real. It's not random who it is that believes the pandemic is a hoax. It's not random who thinks that wearing a mask is inefficient. It is a consequence of the top-down influence I was just describing among people that are supporters of the president. That's true whether it's Trump or Obama. Much of what they think comes from what the president says. And Donald Trump, in my view, and you can certainly disagree, has for his entire term been challenging and dismissing scientific evidence, has been lying about things that he says that are even on video, has sought to persecute a lot of people that are different from him or in conflict with the American identity that he supports. And we find ourselves in a moment now with this pandemic, with this public health crisis, where the need to follow scientists and experts has never been higher. We find now America is in the middle of one of the worst domestic policy failures of our lifetime. America is in the middle of a pandemic that will likely kill more Americans than all of our wars before or after World War II combined. It's a preventable error. It's a mistake that other countries haven't made. And it's a consequence of two things: the current leadership not valuing science and prioritizing his political standing ahead of good evidence-based public policy, and two, the effect that that has on the beliefs of many members of the public who now are unwilling to do things like wear a mask or engage in social distance.
Yeah, it's and so my next question is: are people, like, can you hold them responsible for for believing that, or the masses not being willing to stand up and or can you hold them responsible for not believing everything they hear, or is it just one person says it, and the rest of the people that want to believe that the government's not they're not happy with the government as it is right now, so they want to believe that the government is they theorize that the government is against them, or they're just doing this to make their lives harder. Is that something that's like learned, or something that people pick up with perception, like with experience, or is it just something that they're fed and they just go along with it?
The answer to your questions, all of them, is yes. All of that.
Cool.
Right? We are social creatures. We belong to social groups, and what we think and how we perceive the world. Think about those Ash studies. Think about that Sharif studies I just described. What we think about the world is often shaped by the people that occupy it. And so that's a very human tendency. And that might lead us to adopt beliefs that are in conflict with science, or are otherwise impractical or extreme or whatever. Now, what do we do with that? I would say what we need are leaders that think more rationally in an evidence-based way. That will help. I think that we as individuals have a personal responsibility to be educated, to be informed, to seek out credible information. And if we're unable or unwilling to do so, it's okay to simply say, look, I don't know. I'm not informed. I'm not going to argue with you on Facebook about this. I'm not going to show up to vote. I'm not going to peddle conspiracy theories because I don't know. So humility matters a lot. But social norms matter a ton. And the norms that we have can motivate people to think more critically, think more carefully, and think more empathetically, or not. And people, in their default way of thinking, tend not to be all that critical of information that threatens them, that's in conflict with their beliefs. This is true for liberals. This is true for conservatives. It requires deliberate intention to avoid accepting information that validates us and dismissing information that challenges us. We need to take it as our personal responsibility to seek out information that we disagree with, to seek out multiple sources of information, to act with humility, and when we don't know, act with ethically under conditions of uncertainty. So yes, people can be lazy, they can be selfish, they can be unethical. This doesn't mean that they're evil. It doesn't mean that they can't change and improve. It does mean that they're human beings operating in a particular social context at a particular point in time, but it doesn't mean that they're not personally responsible. They're citizens of a country, a diverse country. They live in a democracy, and it's their job, I would suggest, to be informed and engaged and ethical in how they approach these topics and these issues. So what do we do about it? We lead by example. We show leadership and act with integrity when others are acting unethically. We give them space to grow and save face and learn from mistake. I make mistakes all the time. I could be an asshole. I could be wrong. I could be stupid. It's not a problem if you're learning and growing through those experiences. So we want to acknowledge each other's humanity, but we also want to hold each other to high standards that we expect of one another if we want this experiment of America democracy to succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like when it comes to politics right now, I don't know which way to go or which way to believe. I mean, I am certainly being like really pushed towards conservatives. I mean, like the conservative belief or their mentality of like sit there, have a rational discussion with us about it, and if you, and most of the time when that happens, somebody always, and more times than not, it's not the conservative value that gets extremely flustered and just like walks out or starts cursing or starts really going into irrational arguments. Where am I getting with this? I mean, so we're I'm just gonna move on, actually. Sorry, I don't know where I was going. I do know where I was going with that, but it's not. Talk to you offline about that. But so there's another thing I wanted to talk to you about. Was well, it's the same topic, I think.
Yeah.
It was the prison experiment. And I think, I mean, I don't know. Do you feel like we covered enough about?
That's a great example again of how the power of the situation and the influence an authority figure can have on people's behavior, right? So that's a very classic demonstration in social psychology, where a psychologist at Stanford brought a bunch of people from the Palo Alto community and put them literally in a prison that he built in the basement of the psychology department at Stanford. And he randomly assigned people to different roles. Some were prison guards, others were prisoners. And what he wanted to observe is how people acted in these contexts. And what he found is that just by being assigned to the role of prisoner or assigned to the role of prison guard, people immediately began acting in ways that conformed with those roles and the expectations attached to those roles. All of a sudden, prison guards were acting abusively, verbally, even physically. All of a sudden, prisoners had developed this helplessness, this inability to speak for themselves against their own maltreatment. And so it's a classic example of how the situation can constrain the way people think and how they act.
Yeah. No, I when I read about that, I couldn't believe it. It only lasted 6 days. I mean, sometimes it takes much less longer. It takes a lot less time to. Well,
they should have ended it sooner. They should have ended it sooner. It's one of those studies that has been criticized for really poor ethical thinking. People were in distress almost immediately. And Philip Zimbardo, the head of the study, the PI, allowed it to continue. Yeah.
Mm. So I want to move on to just training police officers. What you've been doing, but I do. The one question I have before we move from. It's probably relevant after we speak about about what you do with the police departments and what you're trying to find out. And I know you got a good story about an experiment that you did at a place.
Oh, that's right. I should tell the police interrogation study.
Yes, please.
So I've done a lot of work in basic science and applied to the legal domain, and the latter has involved lots of different studies with police. And one of the studies that I did many years ago involved an evaluation of how police officers interrogate a suspect and whether or not their questioning and how they interact with that suspect is influenced by the police officer's expectations about the evidence against that suspect. So we were really trying to understand what psychologists refer to as a confirmation bias, where people's prior expectations, prior beliefs shapes their behavior in ways that deviates from standards of objectivity. And the hypothesis was that police officers who think a suspect is guilty would ask more accusatorial and more close-ended questions, and somebody who was less of the belief that the suspect was guilty would ask more open-minded questions and would actually ask questions that are more diagnostic of the suspect. It's a hypothesis that was well grounded in existing work in the domain, and we were really excited to have the opportunity to study this with actual police officers. So this was a police department in the Northeast, and what we did was, with the cooperation of the police, we created a crime scene, and we created a crime scene that allowed us to manipulate the level of criminal involvement of participants that we invited to come to the police department. So we created a series of events that led people to be more or less involved in a crime, and then we manipulated to police officers' expectations about the evidence against the suspect. So we had 4 conditions. We had a guilty or innocent suspect, and we had police officers that believed the suspect was guilty versus not guilty. What we wanted to see is whether or not these conditions varied the interrogation practice. And we were inviting members of the broader community to come to the police department for relatively minor compensation to participate in this study. And they were going to go through the crime scene, and then they were going to be interviewed and interrogated by police, and that was going to be filmed. On the first day that we were going to begin doing this study, we had a bit of an incident. Unfortunately, one of our participants, someone who was very much enthusiastic about cannabis, showed up at the police department very high and with a ton of drugs on his body. The police, of course, detected this pretty quickly and had to arrest our unknowing participant. Unfortunately, this led us to have to shut the whole experiment down. So this was a Darwin Award, Pearson, where we had somebody who knew that they were going to be going to a police department, interviewing and interacting with police, interrogated by police, and they showed up
with a bag of weed.
Too relaxed. That's right. So we had to do that study.
Okay. How long ago was this? Where was this in Boston?
This was in New York, so this was about.
Oh yeah, so it's absolutely illegal. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this was the police department was not in New York; it was in the surrounding area. But this was before the legalization movement and even the recreational movement had gained traction.
Yeah.
This was just kind of a bonehead move.
Oh, it's still illegal in New York.
Is it decriminalized now in New York?
In New York City, I believe it is. Like Philadelphia decriminalized a few years ago. Like I guess individual cities can do that, or where they're telling the police their patrol officers to not waste their time with small amounts of cannabis or stuff like that. Which is great because I think like 85% of imprisoned people are either there for a nonviolent drug offense or back in jail from probation from a small amount of illicit drugs or something like that. So
or awaiting bail for low-level offenses. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's absolutely a priority for reform to focus on shifting police resources and attention to these kinds of low-level drug offenses.
Yeah. No, it's crazy. And that's one of those things that I firmly I don't agree with any. I don't know. I don't agree with most laws that are put there that are specifically for offenses that really cannot have it doesn't really have anything to do with physical harm or whether it's physical, financial, or mental harm. You know, if you're a consenting adult, you should probably, and it doesn't hurt anybody or it doesn't hurt any animals, you should be able to do it. And yeah, I guess that's just I don't understand all these I don't know. The whole human rights thing, right? So what do you do with the police departments? What do you how do you train them?
Right. So psychologists have been studying for decades, and we've talked a little bit about this, sources of error and bias and people's judgments, right? And how sometimes we don't always make the correct decision. Sometimes we make assumptions. Sometimes we act on basis of stereotypes. Sometimes we misread the broader social context. So psychologists have a lot to say about improving objectivity and decision-making. And I have spent years now with my colleagues here at Harvard and elsewhere trying to export that science into a protocol or program for training police so that they're less likely to act in bias. Now, what we know is that bias and judgment becomes more likely when people are operating under stressful situations, when the social context is uncertain or ambiguous, when there's threat. That is the kind of conditions that police are constantly working in, right? And it's a very human thing. Police officers aren't unique in having bias. We all have biases. Bias, again, is just a fancy word for describing judgments or behaviors that deviate from some standards of objectivity. And so we are exporting that science into programs that we can train police in. And you probably, Pearson, you might have heard this, others might as well have heard of implicit bias or implicit bias training. And that focuses on processes that are often operating outside of people's awareness, or things that they can't control very well, that lead them to make split-second decisions and judgments that they might not otherwise make if they have more of an opportunity to deliberate. So we see in the case of police violence, we see in really in all levels of the criminal justice system, and in many other contexts as well, we see evidence of racial bias, and we see evidence of other kind of biases as well. Same circumstances, same case facts, same backgrounds of the defendant, treated very differently, unfortunately, because of race or ethnicity. And we can understand that from a psychological perspective. And so what we've been doing is using that body of evidence to help police officers understand their own minds, help them understand situations or contexts in which bias may be more common, and train them to learn how to think more objectively. It's very similar, Pearson. We've had this conversation before. It's similar to the kind of crisis training that you've provided, right? Where we make people aware of issues or events that might lead them to act in ways that are problematic or in conflict with their professional goals. And we try to help them understand it, and we train them and educate them on ways to avoid it. And over time, they become really good at it. They become effective at it, efficient at it. It occurs automatically, so that even under time pressure, even under stress, they're able to implement it without much thought or energy, to do so really well. So that's what we've been doing here in Boston. This is something that is commonly implemented in some municipalities, especially diverse cities like California, LA, even Chicago. I think the need for improved training goes up, or has gone up, obviously because of George Floyd and others. And this is simply using the science of human psychology to improve judgment and decision-making of police, but also we do the same thing for surgeons and medical doctors. We do the same thing for educators and teachers. So police aren't unique or exceptional. And you know, in my view, many of the police that I've worked with are really just tremendous. They do incredible work in their communities, are very much committed to trying to resolve these issues, to strengthen the relationship that they have with the people that they serve, and are very much open to the training and benefit from the training. There is, of course, some that don't, and that's a real challenge as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I never had any issues with any of the police officers we trained at Philadelphia Police Academy, nor the Delaware Port Authority, or we had a couple departments that came onto the Port Authority, and then the Camden County Police. And Camden County came a long way, and I didn't really realize. Well, I mean, I didn't really realize it until I was walking to the Others Grateful Dead concert in Camden with, who was I with? I think it was with Dave Matteo and Liam Cogman. But this is like a couple of years ago, and I was walking. Like we parked all like pretty far away from the Tweeter Center or whatever it's called now, and it was like day and night from when like we were in high school when we would go down there. Like it was really dangerous back then, and now they have this initiative since 2015 where like the police are out of their cars more. They're not like patrolling with vehicles, and there's not that the fence. You know what I mean? They're like, people actually see the police officers every day. They're in their neighborhood. They interact with people a lot more. They're on bicycles instead of their vehicles, and like posted up. And I know Philadelphia adopted some of that too. But and that's what it's got to be. I feel like with the way that I train, what we train the police in the crisis intervention, it's seriously at the end of the day, it's just listen to this, like make yourself available to this person in crisis.
Empathize.
Empathize. Like you might not feel what you might not want to be there. You might not want to be doing this. You might they might be saying some stupid shit to you, but just listen. That's like somebody told me yesterday, and I did not research this, but I'm just gonna say, there's a much higher percent of people that don't have anyone to talk to in this world, truly talk to, than do. And I know for a fact, if you take that extra 2 minutes out of your day to call somebody you've been thinking about, or isn't doing it. I can't tell you how many times I've seen somebody say something on Facebook that, like, I'm just like, damn, this dude, like, this person really needs somebody to fucking talk to. And I'm really glad I did. I mean, there's been a few times where I was like, fucking, what the hell am I getting myself into here? But with every person needs that human interaction, and a lot of people don't get it, especially now that we're in this. You guys are in this lockdown.
Yeah.
And it's important to realize that, and it's even for. I always preach this. It's just like to go out of your way just for 30 seconds or a minute of your time. It's worth it for somebody else's life. Like, how many things have ever been done for you that just the courteous compliment, or the door being held when you're all frustrated, or somebody smiling at you and saying thank you. It goes a long way.
Yeah, it does.
And that's how we try. It's how I hope the police officers take the hour or two that the VA crisis intervention team comes in. So, and I'm glad that we do it with upper echelon police. It's not just like it's not a basic training academy course. It's officers that are already out, experienced, all the way up to sergeants and lieutenants. So
that's right.
It trickles down. If they're
it won't work if you don't have the buy-in from the top, right?
Yeah.
That's been my experience, is that you do get some more resistance among the average police officer, but ultimately the leadership understands these issues really well, and
they got to deal with it too.
Yeah. Pearson, you describing your training of police just reminds me of, we ask so much of police, and people don't realize that, like, very little of what police actually do involves crime, involves investigating crime, deterring crime. Certainly even less of it involves dealing with violent situations. Much of what police officers are social workers, or they're serving their community in ways that are different than what we might see in movies and on cops. Many of them are responding to mental health crises. Many of them are responding to homelessness and domestic disputes, or other things that they're not adequately trained for. And we put them in these situations where we expect them to be able to negotiate, or resolve conflicts, where they don't have the training, they don't have the resources, and they don't have the support. And so the training that you offer is a great step in that direction. But I think ultimately I've come to the view that a lot of the things that we're going to try to train police to do probably aren't things that we want the police to be doing, that we need others that are able to pick up the phone and talk to that person that's in the middle of a mental health crisis and help them understand that they're valued and respected by their community. Get them in touch with mental health resources, or somebody that's able to, walk home a child from school because his parents aren't available, or is there to help mentor and coach disadvantaged youths so that they have a place to go after school. These are things that a lot of police officers are already doing, a lot of teachers and others are already doing, and we sometimes lose sight of the fact that they aren't adequately trained and aren't always appreciated for the work that they're doing in that space. And I think that one thing we might see in the years to come is sort of a reimagination of public safety and what role police serve in that context, that moves us away from sort of the militarized policing that we're used to, and one that's more focused on the kind of training that you offer, which is equipping police to respond to a wider range of needs and issues within the community, and not treat everything like a crime that needs to be investigated and punished.
Yeah, that's absolutely. Sorry, I'm looking at there's a hell of a lag between us talking in the.
Or are we getting live feedback from folks? But there's a little bit of
No. Oh yeah. So this is a little while ago. So Chad. So here you go. Vitality. You remember Vitality?
Yeah.
I don't know how you could ever forget him. He says, "How about the cops enforce unjust law? How can cops enforce unjust laws? Is that the same thing as the example of cognitive dissonance? Should they do that, or should someone else?" So he's asking about unjust laws. So unjust laws, I mean, under the Constitution, it's Thomas Jefferson put it. Jefferson put it probably the best way I feel was, that I've ever heard was, if a law is unjust, it's not only your right but your duty to disobey it. But so that, I mean, Vitality, the thing with the enforcing unjust laws, like, yeah, so with the police officers are sworn to uphold like their local jurisdiction, the local and municipality laws and the laws of the land. So you have to be able to, you got to be able to like define unjust laws. So like in the military, an unlawful order, like if someone told me to go over and shoot some kid or something, that's not an unlawful order. If the rules of engagement state I need to kill everyone in this area, then that's what the rules of engagement are, whatever. But that's, I mean, not whatever, that's terrible. But if they say anything other than like enemy combatants, which like that person wouldn't be, that I'm giving this example of, which I am obligated not to listen to that, follow that order. With unjust laws, like, I mean, you're hoping that your jury of peers, when you get arrested for it, are going to follow are going to believe the same thing as you do, and that's called jury nullification. That's where that's going to come in if it is an unjust law, and you do get arrested for it, and you fight it, and you go in front of a group of your peers, and seriously, NJ Weedman, but fought some charges. He was in jail for 454 days, 50 odd days, but he fought it, and he got the jury to nullify it. So the jury decided that the law was unjust, and therefore he was not guilty for the crimes. So, but with him admitting that he was guilty of it, but the jury's understanding that and allowing him to do that. So I hope that answers your question.
Good question.
How did so Chad asked, how did wearing masks become political? Other countries all wear masks. Seems like it's the biggest issue.
That's a great question, Chad. My answer to that is that I think that it became political because it is political. I talked a little bit earlier about how like people's political opinions or public opinion about political issues is shaped not just by bottom-up processes, but also top-down dynamics. And there's a lot of people in this country that seek out some information sources and ignore others. And for some, that means being more deferential to the information that they're seeing that suggests that masks are unnecessary or not needed. So the top-down influence, in my perspective, on mask wearing comes from the President of the United States devaluing masks, not wearing a mask, mocking those who do wear masks, opposing scientists that recommend wearing masks. It became political because a political leader adopted a political perspective on a question of public health. So that's, I think, why. Now, that's not the only reason why. There's a lot of other reasons why people might be resistant to wearing masks. But remember, a lot of what people believe comes from the people that they trust and what they think the leaders represent and what others are engaged in. And if you're embedded in a community where people aren't wearing masks, don't think wearing masks are worth it, and listen to the president who says, in my view, don't wear a mask, even though the scientists and public health experts recommend it, they're going to come to the belief that masks aren't worthwhile. And over time, that might even become a part of their identity, where they're particularly belligerent in defending the belief that accompanies that identity. So wearing masks has become politicized because of a strategic choice made by influential political leaders to adopt a strong position on the wearing of masks. Had Trump worn a mask in public, had he advised people to wear masks, had he allowed scientists to express their view that mask wearing is important, we would have seen far less non-compliance. That's my view. And there's some evidence in political science suggesting, for example, that people who get most of their news from Fox News hold a lot of views that are in conflict with what scientific recommendations are suggesting. So the more somebody watches Fox News, the more they're likely to believe that masks aren't worthwhile, that social distancing isn't useful, that the economy should be reopened, that the coronavirus is a hoax altogether. Leadership matters.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's, down to the family model. I mean, like leadership as a parent all the way through leadership as a boss or a manager or leadership as, even peer to peer. Like if you're, I've never understood why it's rude to talk about religion or politics when they're the most important thing in people's lives.
I agree.
Yeah. Like, why wouldn't you want to talk about the things that or why wouldn't you want to express or debate why or why you don't follow one belief or follow one person or the other? It restricts us from being knowledgeable on other things. Like when I what's it called? Like when I went to Iraq, I first thing I did was I went into the PX and I bought a Quran, and this is me at like 19. And it was the English translation. I don't know why I waited till I got to Al Assad, but it is. I mean, I was born and raised. I was raised kind of Catholic. My whole family was Catholic, but yeah, I always tried to become religious, like to the point where I read everything I possibly could, and it just never stuck. But and maybe that's why I don't understand why people don't talk about it. It might be a fear of being talked out of it, or
it's a fear of being talked out of it. But it's a personal sort of. It feels personal, and it feels as though one doesn't want to debate something that is so important to them, right?
Yeah.
So, I think that a lot of people don't want to face criticism, are averse to divergent views, do not want to encounter dissent, adopt their religious or their political identities as a way of feeling more certain and confident in themselves, and don't really want to deal honestly with criticisms that challenge it. But I totally agree. I think that the reason it's taboo is because there's lots of disagreement and it can escalate to incivility. We all know what that looks like.
Yeah.
But I think that there's nothing that you, Pearson, could possibly do that has as large of an effect on my life than who you choose to be our political leaders, right?
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
And, I wouldn't even say at the national level, probably more so at the local level, but we're talking federal politics here, and it's hugely consequential. I mean,
absolutely. And that's something I realized real quick when I came out to Alaska and I started getting involved with like the cannabis world, where you have to go and sit in front of the local leaders, and they determine whether or not you get this license or not. And
right.
It's really, you got to know who these people are, and you got to really pay attention to the local politics, because they're the ones that can rezone stuff. They can give you the yay or the nay, and you have to be able to come up and really, like, they are like your local politicians, the local elected officials are the ones that you have to interact with, and you get to, and it's at this level where you get to interact with them, and you can go to the same coffee shop as they do, or this or that, and so you are completely reliant when you are in a position where you need something to be done, for whether it's for your business or the betterment of your close community it's really those municipality, the local municipality are the ones that you really have to go to and really relying on. Where the president, I don't see like the president has a lot of power when it comes to worldly issues and stuff like that, but he doesn't make the laws. I mean, the laws are drafted up by the Senate and the House and pushed on after they're approved.
But he has a lot of authority. I mean, here's a person.
Oh yeah, he can send the Marines anywhere for 30 days. You know, like
well, not even that. He can interpret how to enforce the laws and what kind of resources to allocate towards. Here's a personal example that happened a couple of days ago. The Trump administration in the last few days has moved aggressively to essentially deport students that are international that are attending American universities. That's a hugely consequential action.
Oh yeah, Harvard's actually suing him for that.
Harvard and MIT are suing him over this. So Donald Trump is trying to deport half of my students because they come from a different country. One of the main reasons why American institutions of higher education are the top ranked scientific institutions in the world is because we attract people from all over the world to come and study here. Now, Donald Trump's effort to deport my friends, my students, my colleagues is deeply personal. And I've spent a lot of time arguing with Trump supporters over his immigration policies. And this was an inevitable decision because he's basically said from the very beginning that this was a goal that he had, was to deport people that are essentially not, in his view, deserving of being here. That's a hugely consequential event in my life. And that's just one example. I can come up with dozens of others. So, the decision to select the president of the United States is deeply personal. It's hugely consequential. And people shouldn't be shy in speaking their minds. They should seek to be civil and generous in adopting an open mind, but they also shouldn't be afraid to dissent in the face of immoral and unethical behavior. Think of those Milgram studies, for example.
Yeah.
Dissent matters. Speaking your mind matters.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess like when I was, I'd like to think I was like shy when I was younger, but I guess looking back, I guess I wasn't. But
you weren't. What are you talking about?
I know. All right. Maybe that's why I'm so outgoing now, is because I thought I was shy. I don't know. But yeah, and I guess trying to think if there's something. I know we're going on an hour and 40 minutes now. But I'm trying to think of anything else that's current events that I'd like to touch on. I think I touched on most of the stuff that I was hoping to get through.
Well, Pearson, one thing that we could consider doing, if you wanted to do this again in the future, we could sort of see if people have questions and things.
Yeah, we can do that. I want to just answer.
And then maybe what we do in the future is maybe do more of a town hall where we invite questions and people, like Chad.
Vitali.
Come in and I think that would be.
I'd love to see Vitali anyway. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Vitali can if it has lots of really great questions and thoughts on the matter. Mm-hmm. So we can open that conversation up if you like.
That would be great. Because like I said it earlier. I said it maybe offline that this isn't about like I get to talk to you all the time. Or whenever. So I'm able to ask you these questions offline. Not many people are able to have access to someone that's in your field of study and that's at the top of your game on it. So that's the real reason.
If you guys have questions, email Pearson, send them to me. Pearson, I'd love to do this again if you have me.
Yeah.
If not, we can find an alternative way of doing it. And honestly, I would very much like to learn from others too and hear what they have to say and what they think.
Yeah, and that's important. That's the best part. That's the best way to learn about people is talking to people, right?
You got it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I just want to thank. We're gonna get offline here. I want to thank MassCan's for letting us use the platform. Everybody that watched, we really appreciate it. I hope you learned something. I hope you gained something from this, and make sure you do something nice for somebody today that doesn't expect it. Yeah. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Pearson. Thank you, MassCan's. Best wishes, everybody.